Welcome, everyone. My name is Paige, and I am with Deschutes Public Library, and we are joined today by Elizabeth Wetmore, author of her debut novel, Valentine. Elizabeth, thank you so much for being here tonight.
For having me.
Tonight, before we get started, we will have Elizabeth give a little bit of a reading, and then she will go into a presentation on what it was like growing up in Texas and what it's like writing about where you come from and your family. And then we will have a Q&A at the very end, so please stick around for that. Our author tonight is Elizabeth Wetmore. Before devoting herself to writing, Elizabeth variously tended bar, taught English, drove a cab, edited psychology dissertations, and painted silos and cooling towers at a petrochemical plant. For a time, she lived in a one-room cabin in the woods outside of Flagstaff, Arizona, while she worked as a classical music announcer. A native of West Texas, she is most at home in the desert, near the sea, or on the side of a mountain. She lives in Chicago, but she dreams of being bi-coastal, Lake Michigan and Lake Travis. A graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, Elizabeth has been the grateful recipient of a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts and 2 fellowships from the Illinois Arts Council. Set in the oil fields of West Texas in 1976, Valentine is her first novel. So, Elizabeth, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you for being here tonight. Tell us everything.
Paige, thank you so much for having me. Good evening, everyone. I'm so glad to have the opportunity to spend a little time with you tonight to talk about the importance of place in my debut book, Valentine. And I'll start with reading a couple of pages. I'm actually just going to start with the first paragraph and read the first couple of pages, and then I'll read a little bit more later. The first chapter is called Gloria. Sunday morning begins out here in the oil patch a few minutes before dawn, with a young roughneck stretched out and sleeping hard in his pickup truck, shoulders pressed against the driver's side door, boots propped up on the dashboard. He wears his cowboy hat pulled down far enough that the girl sitting outside on the dusty ground can see only his pale jaw. Freckled and nearly hairless, it is a face that will never need a daily shave, no matter how old he gets, but she is hoping he dies young. Gloria Ramirez holds herself perfectly still. She is a downed mesquite branch, a half-buried stone, and she imagines him face down in the dust, lips and cheeks scoured by the sand, his thirst relieved only by the blood in his mouth. When he startles and shifts roughly against the truck door, she holds her breath and watches his jaw clench, the muscle working bone against bone. The sight of him is a torment, and she wishes again that his death will come soon, that it will be vicious and lonely, with no one to grieve for him. The sky turns purple in the east, then blue-black, then old bucket slate. In a few minutes, it will be stained orange and red, and if she looks, Gloria will see the land stretched tight beneath the sky, brown stitched to blue, same as always. It is a sky without end, and the best thing about West Texas, when you can remember to look at it. She will miss it when she goes, because she can't stay here, not after this. She keeps her eye on the pickup truck, and her fingers begin to press themselves lightly against the sand, counting 1, 2, 3, 4. They are trying to keep her from making any sudden moves, to keep her quiet, to keep her among the living for another day. Because Gloria Ramirez might not know much on this morning, February 15th, 1976, but she knows this: if he hadn't passed out before he sobered up enough to find his gun or get his hands around her throat, she would already be dead. 52, 53, 54. She waits and watches, listens as some little animal moves through the mesquite, and the sun, that small, regular mercy, heaves itself over the earth's edge and hangs burning in the east. And her fingers keep on. Daylight reveals miles of pump jacks and oil field litter, jackrabbits and barbed wire fences, clumps of mesquite trees and buffalo grass. In piles of caliche and stacks of old pipeline, rat snakes and copperheads and rattlers lie entwined, their breath slow and regular, waiting for spring. When morning has come all the way in, she sees a road, and behind that, a farmhouse. It may be close enough to walk to, but it's hard to say. Out here, 1 mile can look like 10, 10 could be 20, and she knows only that this body, yesterday she would have called it mine, sits in a pile of sand somewhere in the oil patch, too far from town to see the water tank with her town's name painted on the side, Odessa, or the bank building, or the cooling towers at the petrochemical plant where her mother works. Soon, Alma will come home from a night spent cleaning offices and brake shacks. When she steps into the one-bedroom apartment that still smells of last night's hominy and pork and Tio's cigarettes, when she sees that the sofa bed where Gloria sleeps is still made up from the day before, Alma might feel worried, maybe even a little afraid, but mostly she will be pissed off that her daughter is not home where she belongs again. I'll stop there. So, thank you. For me, place is as integral to my fiction as character or description or dialogue. It does truly, as Eudora Welty said in a 1972 interview with the Paris Review, define and confine what I'm doing or trying to do when I tell a story. And while this has always been true in my writing, I almost always start with landscape and move forward from there. Writing about West Texas then was the place where I'm from, was something that I tried to avoid altogether. If every poem or book is a love letter to a person or an idea or a place, it took me a very long time to love West Texas well enough to write about it. So Valentine, which I began in my mid-30s, was in process for about 14 years. And I like to joke with my friends that I began writing this book about my hometown filled with rage and a sense of alienation. And I ended with a sense of love and rage. So to tell you a little bit about my hometown, without the petroleum industry, my hometown would still just be an isolated stop between Fort Worth and El Paso, a place to maybe load up a few cattle and sheep, maybe a little sorghum and cotton. And like much of the land around Marfa and Presidio, an area that includes the austere and stunningly beautiful Chihuahuan Desert, West Texas would still be an empty and wild place with a smattering of ranches and farms, a place mostly inhabited by snakes and birds and mountain lions, maybe a few Mexican-American families who were there $500, whose families were there 500 years before Texas was even a twinkle in Stephen Austin's eye, and maybe a few intrepid weirdos who dig the stark landscape. And so, unless you follow high school football or have ties to the oil and gas industry, you maybe have never heard of my hometown. It's a smallish city that feels like a small town, located in the vast oil-rich region known as the Permian Basin. And sometimes described by locals as 300 miles from anywhere, 300 miles from Dallas, 300 miles from El Paso, 300 miles from Austin, give or take 50 or 60 miles. It's a flat, treeless landscape covered with mesquite trees, caliche, barbed wire, rattlesnakes and rats, drilling rigs and pump jacks, or as my dad used to call it, 86,000 miles of the same old, same old. And yet, for all its geographical isolation, it is also a region that has an outsized impact on politics, the global economy, and most of all, the climate catastrophe. So now, due to increased fracking and horizontal drilling, the Permian Basin is, or was before the pandemic hit, on track to become the largest oil producer in the world, outpacing Saudi Arabia and bringing with it disastrous consequences for the region and the planet, but most importantly for those who live and work and call the area home. In some ways, I'm writing about a Texas, my book is set in 1976. I'm writing about a Texas that no longer exists. In many ways, Texas is better now. It's more complicated, more diverse. More voices are being heard politically, culturally, and artistically. And in other ways that profoundly impact its own citizens and the entire planet, really, Texas hasn't changed a bit. My hometown, even now, still struggles with systemic racism and xenophobia. And although a slight majority of citizens identify as Latinx, about 50.6% the last time I checked, which is a major demographic shift since 1976, depressingly low rates of voter turnout, most likely due to disenfranchisement and voter intimidation, mean that there is not a single person with a Latinx surname on the city council. And then, of course, there's also the issue of women's power in towns like the one where I grew up. Then in 1976, as now, an economy built on the extraction of oil and gas is a profoundly male-centered economy. To put it bluntly, there aren't a lot of jobs for women working in the oil patch. So roughnecking, hauling water or sand to frack sites, working on a drilling rig, even today, these relatively well-paying jobs tend to go to men. The jobs available to women in my hometown, and here I'm talking about working class women without a lot of resources, college, money, practical support, tend to be in the service industry. So waitressing, bartending, working in hotels, caring for children. To put some numbers to this, in 2010, at the last census, the median income for a working man in Odessa, Texas was about $50,000. The median for a working woman, $19,000. So of course, there's always a pay disparity between men and women wherever you live. But the disparity in West Texas is even greater, 50,000 for men versus 19,000 for women. To contextualize this a little bit, in Boston, the mean pay for a man is just over 52,000, and for women, it's just over 46,000. So Valentine was forged from this cultural and economic landscape. I grew up there, was born and raised there, and left when I was 18 with the idea that I would never look back. But before I left, I spent a good portion of my childhood eavesdropping on my mother and her girlfriends as they sat on the back porch after dinner with cigarettes and mixed drinks, rehashing their day and complaining about the heat, their bosses, their husbands, us kids. And so I knew these women's voices as well as I knew the terrain, the dust in the oil derricks, the sun and heat, the graft and violence that comes with each and every oil boom, and the raw desperation that takes hold when the bottom falls out of the oil markets. I knew the cadence of these characters' speeches from listening to my mother and her girlfriends, the lifts and the dips, the elongated vowels and the extra syllables that distinguish a West Texas drawl from other regional accents, the seemingly random addition of syllables at the ends of words and S's, and the musicality of asking how come instead of why. And incidentally, that drawl is actually beginning to disappear. You hear it less and less often in the voice of anyone under the age of 40. And the book also had its origins in the voices of the girls I ran around town with when I was a bit older. And these were girls who, shouted and fought and, would gladly kick your butt if you looked at us sideways. They were girls who pilfered beer money from their mother's purses or the till at work. They, drove out to the oil fields and dared each other to climb up on a drilling platform. The girls I grew up with were girls who got pregnant and pulled their money for abortions, who drove 300 miles to get to a clinic, who dreamed of going to college or at least someplace else, but had no idea how to make that happen. And they were girls who sometimes wondered if they would live to see 30 and then didn't. And so I'm going to pause here and actually read a little bit of Jenny's section. This is a chapter that occurs about just a little over maybe a third of the way into the book, a quarter of the way into the book. And in this chapter, a young woman who's 25 is leaving West Texas to go try to find a life that's more in keeping with the life she's dreamed of for herself. And she is leaving behind her 10-year-old daughter. A few miles past the slaughter field, the derricks and I'll start over. A few miles past the slaughter field, the derricks and pump jacks give way to empty desert. On the other side of Pecos, the road begins to rise and fall. The horizon goes jagged and the land turns ruddy and uneven. How lonely it is out there. How lovely. Jenny keeps both hands on the wheel, her eyes shifting back and forth between the temperature gauge and the road ahead. She stops for gas in Van Horn, sitting in her car with her fingers wrapped around the steering wheel while the attendant fills the tank and washes the windows. Cigarette dangling from his lips, he checks the tire pressure and asks if she needs anything more. His coveralls are the same gray as Deborah Ann's eyes, and there's a small oval Gulf oil patch on his breast pocket. "No, thank you," she says and hands him $5. He points to her back seat. "You forgot to return your library book before you left town." Jenny twists around to see Art in America surrounded by candy bar wrappers and one of Deborah Ann's graded spelling tests, the first two words, canceled and trespassing, both misspelled. At the stockyards outside of El Paso, she rolls the window up tight, her eyes and skin burning when the stench of methane gas seeps through the vents. She is 10 miles from the New Mexico border, the farthest she has ever been from home. Beauty. Beauty is not for people like us, her grandma said when Jenny tried to explain why she liked to sit and look at pictures in the afternoon. "You do better paying attention to what's right in front of you," the old woman said. "If you wanted to spend your life thinking about such things, you should have thought of that before or been born someplace else." And maybe that's true, but it seems like a high price to pay, and maybe Jenny's not willing to make the trade, the world or her daughter, because it's clear she can't have both. When the fan belt finally snaps on the other side of Las Cruces, Jenny's car shudders to the highway shoulder. She gets out of the car and watches the moon rise over the desert like a broken carnelian, and such has been her fear and grief and longing that for many years she will not remember the man who pulled up behind her car, his truck wheels grinding against the caliche-covered highway shoulder. She will not remember the words on the side of his truck, Garza and O'Brien, tow and repair, or that he fetched his toolbox from his truck and replaced the belt on the spot while she leaned against the trunk and looked at the stars and wept without making a sound. And she will not remember what he said when Jenny tried to give him a few dollars. "Young lady, I can't take your money. Pues, good luck." She will have seen 1,000 miles of sky before she is finally able to stop moving. Flagstaff, Reno, one short and sorry stint in Albuquerque that she tries hard to forget. Weeks and months sleeping in her car after a day spent cleaning houses or a night waiting tables. She will drive through the Sonoran Desert, its washes and ravines disappearing into box canyons. She will sit at the edge of a meadow just above the Mogollon Rim, newly covered with snow. The road that leads away is full of switchbacks so tight Jenny has to stop and back up and hope that nobody comes around the corner before she can make the curve. There will be a bar in Reno where the same old lady shows up every night at 9 o'clock and stays until close, her lips creased with lipstick, fingernails the color of blood, her smile as fierce and hard and true as the voice Jenny sees in the mirror most mornings. All of this is beautiful to her. The sky and sea, attics and old ladies, musicians playing in subway stations, museums at the end of the line. She will see bridges overcome by fog and sylvan forests teeming and dark and full of hidden water. Every place has a different kind of sky, it turns out, and much of this earth is not nearly as brown and flat as Odessa, Texas. All this wild green beauty and still, always, a hole in her heart the size of a little girl's fist. Jenny will drive that Pontiac into the ground and grieve for it when it's gone. Never, she thinks, will I love a man the way I love that car. And when people she meets along the way wonder about her, when they try to know her, some of them will love her and she will love some of them, but never as much as the daughter who grows taller every day without her. When they ask, "What's your story?" or "Where are you from?" Jenny never knows quite what to say. Each time she just packs up her car and drives away. So I'll stop there. So last week there was a freaks snowstorm in my hometown, and my sister sent pictures of the ranch. And snow is rare in West Texas, and the storm shuts down schools and stores and city offices. Practically everyone stays home except the ranchers, who have to drive out and break up the ice that forms on the water tanks, lest the cows die of thirst. And the snow, of course, is always gone by the next day. These cold fronts move through pretty quickly. Unlike here in Chicago, right, where gray skies linger for weeks, in West Texas, the sun will come out, the air will warm, and the snow melt will quickly be absorbed into the eternally parched land. But in the pictures my sister sends, the sky is steely. A light dusting of snow covers sparse vegetation. The slender mesquite branches sag under the weight of it. An outcrop of pale caliche is speckled with white flakes. And in the last picture she sent, my sister's favorite old cow, Bugs, stands next to their pickup truck, her soft snout pushing through the truck's open window, her black coat turned gray by snow. "How is it out there?" I asked my sister when I called later that afternoon. "Quiet," she said. She told me that even the oil and gas workers took the day off. I was standing in the kitchen with a pencil in my hand. Outside my window, Lake Michigan lay flat and still all the way to the horizon. On a calm winter day, the lake and sky in Chicago don't look so different from the earth and sky of West Texas. And I have to squint to make it happen, and the colors don't quite match up, but I can get there if I try. And I'm always imagining this place, particularly as I sit down and try to tell my stories. And so, I miss my sister, and I have no idea when I'll see her again, something I know all of you are familiar with, or many of you are. And if Valentine is a love letter to that place, and it is, and to the people who live there, what I mean to say is that I miss the kind of quiet of that place that lasts for long enough that when the wind picks up, you can hear it plucking at sandhills outside of Monaghan's. I miss the grit and the warmth. And now, as we confront a climate catastrophe of our own making, I think of the West Texas I wrote about in Valentine and the West Texas I see now when I go home for a visit. I'm old enough to remember when there were more birds and insects and critters, more open spaces and dark skies, and more quiet places. And so I look forward to the day that this sweet old world of ours comes to its senses and shakes off the death grip of the petroleum industry. And when that happens, nowhere will that change be felt more immediately and deeply than in West Texas. And so when I'm writing about where I'm from, as well as in all my other work, I'm trying always to cleave to a piece of advice I once heard about writing. I don't know exactly who it comes from, and it may be apocryphal. Maybe Flannery O'Connor, maybe Eudora Welty, maybe Carson McCullers. One of those wonderful old grandmamas of Southern literature. But I've always tried to cleave to this piece of advice, and it's very simple. If you're going to write fiction, it better be true. And sometimes, of course, I lost that thread of courage that bound me to the book, and that slowed me down some. It occurred to me at some point as I was working on the book, and I worked on my book on and off for about 14 years. I began when I was pregnant with my son, and when the book came out last March, my baby boy was 6'2" and 15 years old. So, so I had to decide at some point in writing about my hometown that none of this was worth doing if I wasn't willing to risk failing miserably to tell the story of that place and the people, those characters, and then let the chips fall where they may. For me, that meant learning more about where I was from, and it meant being willing to follow my characters wherever they led me, however rocky that terrain might be. And so in the end, the place is real, and the voices are real. The story, the characters are fiction, but I hope I've told their stories with a true and open heart. Which brings me back to Eudora Welty. She wrote about the importance of place in her fiction. It saves me. And by that, she meant that structurally, it gave her a frame. It limited what she could say and how she could say it. She had to be true to the place and to the characters that inhabited that time and place. But when I say, place has saved me as a writer, what I mean is I cannot imagine writing anything without place having a sort of central place in the work. One of the most meaningful comments about Valentine I've ever received came from an early reader who said she felt as if the author had written the book to save her own life. And indeed I am. And I think a lot of us, when we are writing and reading, we're always doing that to save ourselves and each other. One of my writing teachers called it surviving the page. To me, it means telling your stories with a sense of urgency, a sense that this story couldn't wait another minute, that it matters, that the lives of these women and girls in my hometown mattered in 1976, and that they still do, even in places like my hometown, or more particularly, especially in places like that. So with that, I think I'll stop and just kind of open up the floor for questions and just conversation. So.
Elizabeth, that was beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I felt like I gained so much insight into your work, hearing you talk about it with such pride and also such humility, in that it did, to me, sound like you fully gave yourself into this work and attempted not to control it. And I think that is felt on the page as well, the authenticity of the experience.
Thank you.
So thank you. That was beautiful. It's wonderful to get to hear an author read, and what a powerful, powerful book this is to read. I love the way your work opens up with the description of the place. And that is paired so well with the immediately harrowing situation that Gloria Ramirez has found herself in. There's such a vivid scenery, a pairing of vivid scenery and prose with heartbreaking pain and violence. How did you decide on this style of storytelling for Valentine?
Oh gosh, that is such a great question. And I promise I'm not being coy. I really listen to the language and the characters. I love poetry, and I love music, and I read my work aloud constantly. You would never ever see me working in the corner of a coffee house ever, or at least not working on fiction in a coffee house, because I'm constantly reading aloud and sort of altering my writing according to, frankly, how it sounds. The musicality of the language, the movement, the way the words, even the way the words look on the page, is important to me. So the way I decided on this style was I listened to the characters and I listened to the story that was emerging, and I let that guide me.
Yes, well, it's absolutely poetic. So I love that you say that you listen to poetry and music. It's kind of, I think you even mentioned in your talk, you even used the word cadence at one point, and there's definitely a cadence to be felt in this book. So another kind of structure question that we had come up, you have the story is told through multiple perspectives, many different narrators, if you will. And it's very common in a movie or a book where there are multiple characters to have the characters know each other, meet each other, kind of intersect in some way. But what was fascinating about this one is the different places that each of these characters were in the same night. The night that Gloria is attacked, it's revealed how many different characters were there down the road, watching her get into the car, just in the periphery. What was that like for you? How did you frame that? Did you have kind of a who's here and a who's here, like a map of some kind? How did you decide on having the characters interact in that particular way?
It was all Again, it's every decision I make happens in process. I know almost nothing. I knew almost nothing about this book when I began. I had the voices of the women and girls I grew up with sort of ringing in my head. But I discover all of this on the page. Of course, I mean, in a lot of ways, and I think you see this in the book. The short story form is the the form I'm most comfortable with, and in a lot of ways the form I love most. And I think you see that in this book. A lot of these chapters are, can almost stand alone as an independent piece. And that's very much by design. But of course, when you're writing a novel and giving yourself the wiggle room to explore ideas in a more sort of thorough way, then the question becomes, how do these people, overlap? So I just would ask myself really practical questions. How can I sort of turn up the heat on Corrine and Potter's relationship? Corrine is a character who, when the book opens, she's just lost her, deeply loved husband. And I wanted to tie them into, Glory's story as well. And so, of course, everyone goes to the Sonic, right? I mean, that's just, that's what you do, right? And so it was easy to kind of put them there, but I had to be mindful and careful with that, because I wanted very much to be true, to the circumstances of the characters and the realities of the time and place. The truth is that in 1976, Odessa was a deeply segregated town. And when I say deeply segregated, I'm not kidding. Like, they desegregated my high school in 1982. So, and those and that lingering sort of racism and xenophobia is there to this day. It's getting better, but it's still there. And so, I was very mindful as I was writing the book that I needed to be true to that. And so, for example, the character of Glory, after, she and Mary Rose Whitehead meet on that front porch, they are never in a scene again. And in fact, I very intentionally kept Glory's story very much separate from the white women and girls in the book, because all the other point of view characters are white women and girls, because that seemed true and real to me, that their paths would not cross again, and that Glory's life, after this attack, would work in a very different way than any other character in the book, and so then, of course, I have to ask myself, where would she and her uncle be able to go? What resources would they have? And of course, I mean, I was also very mindful of the very real danger of allowing the white women in this book to swoop in and save her, which I think would have been a disastrous move, and really dishonest, and so, so I worked really hard to sort of keep Glory's story kind of separate from all the other characters. So. And then, of course, I made the decision pretty early to put all of the other characters on Larkspur Lane together. And so once I made the decision that all the other characters except Glory lived on the same street, then it became a lot easier to kind of, entwine their lives. So.
And all those points you just make really resonate with you trying to stick to how it would be. Odessa is a small town. They would probably all be on the same street. That wouldn't be out of the question, out of the ordinary. And I did note that there's a lot of work around, not work, there's a lot of focus on the overt racism in this book, but also the subtle subtexts and the subtle ways that racism comes through, and especially against when Glory is being talked about by the white men in the town. How did that feel? What was that like to write about that for you?
Hard. It was hard. I mean, the first decision that I had to interrogate pretty, that I had to interrogate pretty deeply was, why make this crime happen to a Latina, right, instead of a white girl, right? Why have this happen to Glory? And my thinking for that was that, well, the first thing I thought was that I could not write this book without at least attempting to address the sort of systemic racism that I witnessed as a little girl growing up there, and that took me years to really put into perspective. You know, but I tried very, I was always mindful of sort of coming to the page with an open heart and a true heart, and at the same time not, fighting the impulse to gloss over, to let it be better than it was, or to let it be worse than it was. I think for a lot of us, we come to our sort of understanding of racism and white supremacy from the point of view of you know, seeing it sometimes, in the people we most love in the world, right? And yet those same people, right, are complicated, and so I tried to not gloss over it, but I also tried to, with a few exceptions, there were a couple of minor characters who didn't fare too well, but with a few minor exceptions, I tried to never reduce my characters to nothing more than their circumstances, right? Because otherwise, why do it, right? I mean, the whole point of, at least a lot of my writing is, I want to put characters in action who surprise themselves with their own nobility, right? Their own courage, their own ability to stand up and behave in ways that surprise themselves, so.
Beautifully put. And you really do have a lot of characters who are each struggling with their own specific, burden. And you have the self-made woman who's just trying to hustle the Tupperware around town, and you also have Glory, and those two experiences did not feel contrived when put into the same story, because the context behind them. But something that kind of links all of your characters together is they all struggle with similar things, like the expectations placed on women by themselves and by society. And you've already talked about that a little bit in your presentation about the wage discrepancy between men and women. And what was that like for you, seeing the young women you grew up with and the young mothers in the town? What was it like for you to witness that? And then how did you break out of that cycle for yourself?
It's a great question. Great questions. I think that as a little girl growing up there, I was really sort of blissfully unaware, of a lot of those dynamics. I like a lot of writers. I was kind of a weird kid. I spent a lot of time in the library. I spent a lot of time in the bookmobile. One of the greatest days of my childhood was the day the bookmobile showed up in my neighborhood. And thank you, by the way, for your work. I can't tell you how much librarians have meant to me. I'm the first in my family to go to college. So, so libraries were really places of comfort and support, and they were also places where I was able to, direct my own reading in ways that weren't necessarily available to me, in my West Texas public school, So I was blissfully unaware of a lot of this. And yet when I began to mine my memories, and I looked back at them through the lens of a grown woman and a mother, some things really stood out to me. And one of the things that stood out to me that I was blissfully unaware of as a little girl was how angry, a lot of these women that I knew growing up were, and how hard they were fighting to create a better life for their daughters in particular, and themselves, within the constraints of, a pretty harsh environment without a lot of resources. Two of the characters in my book, Jenny Pierce, whose section I just read, and Mary Rose Whitehead, they left high school, when they got pregnant. So, at 25 years old, they had 10-year-old daughters, 9-year-old daughters. And, and so that was consistent with my experience growing up there, and still is to this day. I think I read somewhere recently that Odessa has one of the highest rates of teenage pregnancy in the state of Texas, which is startling, you know. And when I began working on the book and sort of mining those memories, I did a lot of research. I did a lot of reading. I still go home from time. I still have family there, so I'm there, but I started trying to look at my hometown through a different lens, the lens of someone who wanted to tell these stories. And I found out, obviously I did my research and I read a lot of old newspapers, and, I realized in very short order that, violence against women and girls was endemic. But it was particularly bad during oil booms, when you suddenly had this huge swell in population, primarily young men coming from all over the country to make a quick buck in the oil patch. So I'm kind of rambling a bit. What was the second part of that question?
The second part of the question, you answered how you how did you break free from the cycle?
Oh, thank you. So I like a lot of people who grow up in, I like a lot of people with their hometown. I reached a point when I was, in my, I guess in my early adolescence, where, well, first of all, I should say books really changed that. It was through, I'm 53. So, I grew up pre-internet, and so all of my understanding of the outside world, came from books and television. And it was really in books that I came to understand that every place wasn't like my hometown. So the first thing that happened was I read and I longed to see these other places. And then the second thing that happened was as a young woman who went from being a little girl, to suddenly feeling like I was fair game, right? I felt, an incredible amount of rage, and starting in adolescence. And so my way of coping was just to leave as soon as I could, and I did. I left at 18 with almost no money and no education, and sort of tumbled out into the big wide world, to sort of make my way there. Got a job waiting tables, and eventually made my way to a community college, and then eventually made my way to a 4-year university and got my degree. I think it took me a grand total of 8 or 9 years to actually get my BA, so that was my, that was my story. So the short version, really short version.
All that hard work paid off. You made it to the Iowa Writing Workshop, and you've received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the other fellowships from Illinois. So your hard work is definitely paid off, and that's such an inspiring story, especially considering this book really drives home how difficult is an understatement, how difficult of an environment that was, how oppressive, especially to women. If you don't mind, I would love to read a passage that I particularly loved from your book. This is a section from a very intriguing character, Carla. And she says, "We lose the men when they try to beat the train and their pickup trucks stall on the tracks, or they get drunk and accidentally shoot themselves, or they get drunk and climb the water tower and fall 10 stories to their deaths. During cutting season, when they stumble on the chute and a bull calf roars and kicks them in the heart. On fishing trips, when they drown in the lake or fall asleep at the wheel on the drive home. Pile up on the interstate, shooting at the Dixie Motel, hydrogen sulfide leak outside Gardendale. Looks like somebody came down with a fatal case of the stupid," Evelyn says, when one of the regulars shares the news at happy hour. Those are the usual ways, the ordinary days, but now is the 1st of September and the Bone Springs shale is coming back into play. Now we will also lose them to crystal and coke and painkillers. We will lose them to slipped drill bits or unsecured stacks of pipeline or fires caused by vapor clouds. And the women, how do we lose them? Usually it's when one of the men kills them." That to me was heart-wrenching, and I felt like I was punched in the gut when I read that. And because so much of the book had led to that point, so much of the book had demonstrated that thought, and you could hear how genuine that sentiment was, even though you, as the author, probably struggled to write that. I, as a reader, struggled to consume it. So your book is raw, it's genuine, it's honest, it's heartbreaking. How was your book received then by people, your family, for instance, who were perhaps quote unquote left behind in Odessa in this situation? How was your book received by people who are still living there today?
Well, first, I want to say how lovely it is to hear someone else read that chapter, one of my favorite chapters and one of my favorite characters. And it is a hard book, and it's not a happy book in a lot of ways. And at the same time, I really see these women as absolutely heroic, in their ability, in spite of all of that, right? In spite of all of that, they find a way, to take care of themselves, to take care of their daughters, to take care of each other. That kind of sort of the dignity of the person that people like Marilyn Robinson talk about, some of my heroes. I admired all of these characters so deeply for their resilience, and their courage. The truth is that, because I worked on this book on and off for about 14 years, while I began very much rooted in some of my memories of the women and girls I grew up with, as you take a book draft by draft by draft, they really do become fictional characters, because you have to flesh them out and they take on a life of their own. And suddenly, the character who was based very loosely on, an older woman who lived across the street becomes something, completely different because in service to the story, right? And that being said, I mean, I was anxious about how it would be received, and really so pleasantly surprised by how many notes I've received from people in that part of the world who really felt like they saw their lives reflected in these characters, and men and women, but mostly women. And I got an email shortly after the book came out. It was like 3 sentences, said, "I'm 65 years old. I've lived here my whole life. You nailed it. Thanks for writing this book." And that's been gratifying in ways that I would not have imagined. In part because I don't always think about readers when I'm writing, or I really not often at all. But in part too, because I had made up my mind that the only way to write this book, frankly, was just to not care how it was received, that this was the book I was writing. These were the stories I was telling, and I was going to do it, and so I was surprised at how much it meant to me to hear that the book had really moved people. And I got a couple of cranky, emails, but on the whole, I think I was, it's not an easy book and it pulls no punches. But at the same time, I think it's a fair book, and it accords to each of these characters a kind of dignity. It doesn't reduce anyone really, hopefully, to stereotypes, and so, so I'm glad it went as well as it did. So, so far, yeah.
All right. So, what do you hope readers take away from this book?
Oh gosh. Well, I think one thing I would hope that readers would take away from it is a kind of an interest in the land in that part of the world. Odessa is really, really off the beaten path. You don't happen through there, on your way to somewhere else. I mean, or rarely. It really is in the big middle of nowhere. If you look at a map of Texas, Odessa's like right here where there's nothing else. Odessa and Midland. And so while it's a quiet and subtle point, I think, the way that I was able to access enough affection from the people and my hometown to write Valentine was by falling back in love with the land. And when I went to visit my sister, or my parents, I'd borrow a pickup truck and pack a lunch and just spend entire days driving around out in the oil patch. And in that way, I really fell in love with the land in a way that I did not as a little girl. And so I hope readers kind of take away from it both the value of this place as a place worth saving, in the same way that we don't drill off the coast of California because it's so very beautiful and fragile. The desert is the same. I think a lot of times people don't see the beauty in the desert because it's so stark and harsh. Um, and so that and then I guess the other thing, or one of the other things I would hope people would take away from it, is this idea that no matter who you are or where you're from or what your story is or even what your life has been like up until this particular moment, that there's always time, right? There's always time to kind of step up to the plate and do the things that you're called to do, in the moment. Corrine Shepard is one of my favorite characters. And when this book opens, she's grieving her husband, and she's reached an age and a place in her life where she's kind of made up her mind that she has nothing left to give to the world, and the world has nothing left to give to her, and all her big decisions have been made. And she's not needed. And of course, that's patently untrue, and that's one of the things that changes for her. But I think a lot of us can have those moments in our lives where we feel like we're just not, we're just not up to the task, of what we're called to do in any given moment. I think probably a lot of us are grappling with that right now, so I hope that, my Nana said, and I love this, my Nana would always say, until they carry you out the back door in the pine box, there's always time to change your ways. And I see that with these characters struggling, to do the right thing, or to, just to survive, or to get what they need out of their lives, in spite of, some of their dreams being short-circuited by early motherhood, for example, so yeah.
Beautifully put. Pine box, back door, still time.
Yep. You can be the most hardened old white supremacist in the whole world, and if there's still a breath in your body, there's still time to change your ways.
Yeah, bumper sticker might be really tiny, but
yeah. I mean, redemption is, it's a thing. I believe in it. I believe in it in fiction, and I believe in it in life. So yeah.
Well, this has been such a wonderful evening. Thank you so much for taking the time with us. Before we let you go, any last thoughts? Classic question. What are you working on now? I know that your book just came out, and also there's a bit of a pandemic going on outside, and some authors are saying, I can't write like this. So if you're not working on anything, we forgive you, but we're also dying to know if there's something else coming down the pike, or if there's anything that's exciting you right now.
I have some things I'm working on, but yes, I fall squarely into the category of writers who have spent a lot of my writing time journaling about what's going on in our world and sort of rocking back and forth in the corner, and I've had, we've all had, things going on. I've got a 16-year-old son, who my husband and I are trying to guide through all this, and a kid who at the time in his life when he most needs to be with his peer group, right, is suddenly, home with us all the time, so, but so I've got some stories that I've been working on, and I think I know there are a few characters in Valentine that I'm not quite done with. And so, I'm kind of hoping to sort of pick up their stories again. And so that's what I'm working on, but a lot of journaling, honestly. I have lowered my standards significantly in the last 10 months. And I'm like a lot of us, I'm just, trying to do my part to help my community and my kid and my girlfriends. I have girlfriends who are doing this as single parents with very young children, so, just trying to do what you can, right? So, but yes, I've got things I'm working on as well. So, yeah. And then you said one more thing. So my favorite part of selling my book and actually getting to have a voice in the world, I guess a platform is the word, is getting to recommend other books. And so I was thinking about that tonight. And so I want to commend to y'all a couple of books that are also really deeply rooted in place. And I'm going to recommend two by this young man, Brian Washington, also set in Texas. This is his novel Memorial. It's set in a neighborhood in Houston. The characters are amazing. They're poor, working class, young men of color, queer, trying to sort of make their way in the world. And then his collection of shorts, I just finished this last night and I loved it. And then his collection of short stories that came out just last year is called Lot. As in a lot, and a parcel of land. And so every story in that book is really, really deeply rooted in place. And so both of those, for those of you, I know some of you might be aspiring writers or are already writers, and if you're looking for some more reads that are sort of deeply rooted in place, I recommend both of those. So, yeah.
Thank you. I always feel like I'm getting a secret treasure when an author will recommend to me something that they are reading and loved. And those two books, incredible works, and they're available at your Deschutes Public Library. So check them out.
Yes.
Elizabeth,
yes, grace. He's got such grace. His characters just have, there's so much grace in his work, I think, it's a kind of deep kind of empathy for his characters that is really, that I don't think you can fake, so it's wonderful. He's great. So, yeah.
Well, Elizabeth, you have been great tonight. Thank you so very much for taking the time and for sharing with us these words of wisdom and just your overall presence. We are delighted to have had you tonight.
Thank you. I'm so delighted to be here. Thank you for having me, and good luck with all your writing, everyone, and your reading, and y'all be well. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us tonight, everyone. This is Deschutes Public Library. We have a lot of great fun free programs available at our website, deschuteslibrary.org, as well as our YouTube page. If you are looking for something, we have something for everyone, from story times to author presentations and more. So check us out. We would love to see you next time. Elizabeth, have a great night, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you, everyone.